Thank you, Deb Yavedlin, and thanks to everyone here for joining us on day two, both in person and streaming online. So following a focus on several critical policy areas yesterday, today we'll have a focus, as has been noted, to dive deep into several critical sectors that punch far above their weight. But first, I'm thrilled to introduce today's keynote address that will provide us with an opportunity to widen our view and gain a deeper understanding of the broader economic landscape. Canada is deeply connected to the global economy. Everyone here is quite well aware of that, and the world's trends, therefore, shape our own. So too do the world's challenges. And understanding these dynamics is crucial for our future and for the conversations that we're having today. So to help us understand this broader picture, I'm delighted to introduce Ira Kalish, who, as Martha noted, is the Global Chief Economist at Deloitte. He's a specialist in global economic issues, as well as how economic, demographic, and social trends shape the global business environment. So his insights on these issues are sharp and timely and invaluable for any economy, but especially for ours. After Ira's remarks, we'll also have time for questions, so please take note of anything that you'd like to explore further. But first, please join me in welcoming Ira Kalish.
Okay, thank you, Trevor, and good morning, everybody. So what I'd like to do is talk to you about my views about the major trends in the global economy, some of the headwinds, and some of the opportunities. But I'd like to begin by talking about productivity, because that's why we're here. So let me show you the first chart. Let's see. There we go. So this is a chart that shows labor productivity in several countries. And I define labor productivity as output per hour worked. There are other ways of defining productivity. This is an index where the year 2010 is 100, so it's not a comparison of absolute productivity levels, but it is a comparison of the trend in productivity. The top line is my home country, the United States. The others here are the US, the UK, and Canada, and Japan. And what you can see is the US has clearly outperformed all the other major developed nations. So productivity is a key issue, and it has not performed particularly well in many countries. It has performed well in the US, which is almost a surprise to me because for a while we had stagnant productivity, but now things are moving quite nicely. And let's look at some of the factors that drive this. So what does drive increases in productivity? Well, in the long term, it's innovation in technology and business processes. So when we have innovations, for example, in the past where switchboard operators were replaced by computers, it was a labor-saving technology. And we also have labor-augmenting technologies that boost productivity. And that is the thing that drives it in the long run. And if you look at the average productivity of a worker 100 years ago, they lacked the kinds of technology we have today. Now, what drives that kind of innovation? Well, one thing, obviously, is education. A more educated workforce is a more productive workforce. And certainly in many emerging countries, one of the key issues is to get more people in school, especially more women or girls in school, because that boosts productivity. But also education at the upper level is very important. There was an interesting survey taken by the University of Shanghai, where they looked at the 20 top universities in the world in terms of driving Nobel Prizes, driving citations in scholarly journals, driving patents. And of the 20 top universities in the world, 17 were in the United States. And I'm pleased to say that 6 of them were in my home state of California. And so it's no accident that a lot of innovation actually takes place in California because some of the world's best universities are there, and that brings together some of the smartest people in the world. Infrastructure obviously makes a difference. A lack of adequate infrastructure hurts productivity. And as was discussed earlier, regulation and taxation can make a big difference. Bad regulation and taxation can suppress innovation and entrepreneurship. Good regulation that promotes competition can increase productivity. And obviously, innovations are implemented when businesses invest. So we generally see countries that have higher ratios of investment to GDP have faster productivity growth than other countries. But also it makes a difference what kind of investment takes place. So when you have investment that is driven by entrepreneurship, funded by venture capital, that tends to be better than the more traditional types of investment. And finally, the openness of an economy, on balance, has a positive impact on productivity. More trade, more cross-border investment, more openness to migration. The interaction with the world makes a big difference in terms of productivity. When we put up trade barriers, that allows our businesses to become less efficient, less competitive, and thereby less productive. So these, in my view, are the major factors that drive productivity growth and the major areas that drive the kinds of policies that are needed to drive productivity growth. So why does productivity matter? What is the impact? Well, there are a number of things. First, and very relevant to what we've experienced over the past 2 years, productivity growth lowers inflation. Theoretically, when a business is seeing growth in its own productivity, it can increase wages without having to increase prices because it's getting more from each worker. And in recent years, here in North America and in Western Europe, we saw very tight labor markets drive up wages and contribute to inflation. But in the US, where we had strong productivity growth, that was one of the factors that enabled inflation to come down, even though the labor market remained relatively tight. And obviously, productivity growth boosts economic growth, it improves living standards, and it also boosts tax revenue and helps governments at all levels address their fiscal imbalances. So let me turn to the global economy itself and talk about what has been going on. And we've been through an unusual period in the last few years. We've seen major shocks, trade war, pandemic, war in Ukraine, lockdowns in China, and these shocks created disruption of global supply chains. The chart you see here is an index of global supply chain pressure or stress. And you can see that it was relatively stable over a quarter of a century. And then during the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, it increased dramatically. And this led to shortages and delays, higher costs, and ultimately higher prices. So one of the main reasons why we had a burst of inflation globally over the past 2 years was the fact that global supply chains were badly disrupted, especially by the pandemic. And one of the reasons inflation came down is that the pandemic ended and the supply chain disruption largely ended. And you can see right now the chart is at a relatively favorable level. So let's look at what happened in terms of inflation. This shows the year-over-year percentage change in the consumer price index for the US, Canada, and the UK. The trends are fairly similar, which means that inflation was a global phenomenon, not necessarily related to any particular country's policies. And as I said, it was initially fueled by the pandemic, which disrupted supply chains at a time when consumer demand was shifting away from services and toward goods. Because during the pandemic, of course, we were all staying at home, so we weren't spending money on services like restaurants, movie theaters, airplanes, hotels. Instead, we spent a lot more on goods for the home, furniture, appliances, electronics, and treadmills that we probably didn't use. And the end result with this huge increase in demand for goods at the same time that there was disruption in the production and distribution of those goods was a serious increase in prices. So the inflation began with durable goods. It was then exacerbated, by the war in Ukraine, which boosted energy and food prices initially. And so we wound up with the highest inflation in 40 years. Since then, these things have reversed. Consumer behavior has shifted back towards services. We're getting on airplanes again and going to restaurants. The pandemic ended, the supply chain disruption ended, and although the war in Ukraine continues, the price of oil has come down. So we're now at a pretty favorable place, although still, when it comes to inflation, although goods prices are now declining, service prices are still rising too rapidly in all of these countries, and that reflects the fact that services are labor-intensive and labor markets remain relatively tight, and so that's driving up wages. So that's another reason why productivity matters, because if you have productivity growth, that helps to offset the wage gains that are taking place, which contribute to inflation. So it's another reason why we want stronger productivity growth, as well as its impact on economic growth. And that's also why we want more growth of investment to help implement innovations in technology and business processes. Another factor that drives both inflation and growth is labor force participation. If you look at the chart on the top right-hand side, for 3 countries, that's the job vacancy rate, and it is a measure of the share of available jobs that go unfilled because businesses can't find the people to fill them. So when that vacancy rate goes up, that's a sign of a tight labor market, and indeed that's what happened in the aftermath of the pandemic, and that drove up wages. The good thing is those job vacancy rates have been coming down, in part because of an increase in labor force participation, which you can see on the bottom of the chart, in part because of immigration. That has helped to ease the tightness in labor markets, helped to ease some of the wage pressure, and bring inflation down. And finally, another factor that plays a big role in inflation is actual expectations of inflation. And that's where central banks come in, because one of their goals, aside from directly controlling inflation, is to anchor expectations of inflation. Because when people expect high inflation, they act in ways that exacerbate inflation. So that's why it becomes very important to reduce those expectations. And if you have high inflation, that's not good for growth and productivity, because it ultimately leads to a tightening of monetary policy. And speaking of monetary policy, what you see here on the left-hand side is the benchmark interest rate of the U.S. Federal Reserve. On the right-hand side is the benchmark interest rate of the Bank of Canada. The trends are fairly similar. The Bank of Canada started to loosen monetary policy sooner than the Federal Reserve, but they're both moving in the same direction. And in both cases, what they recognize is inflation is now largely under control, that the lagged effect of this prolonged tightness of monetary policy risks creating economic havoc, because high interest rates damage consumer and business willingness to spend. So they're now comfortable in starting the process of cutting interest rates, and this is likely to continue over the next year. And that will have a positive impact on economic activity and economic growth. And we're already seeing a positive impact from the expectation of lower interest rates on private equity activity. In fact, the amount of money spent on deals by private equity and venture capital companies globally increased 40% this past September from a year earlier. And that's very promising for productivity. Now, the lion's share of that activity took place in the Asia-Pacific region. The second largest amount took place here in North America. Very little of it took place in Europe. So that gives you a sense of where investors have confidence and where there are opportunities to get a return on their investment. So now what I'd like to do is take a little tour of the world and talk about what's going on in some of the major countries in the world. And I'll end with Canada, which is not my area of expertise, but I'll try to say something smart about Canada. But let me start by saying something smart about my home country, the US. We've had extraordinary economic growth in the face of very tight monetary policy, which is a bit of a surprise. Normally, episodes of tight monetary policy lead to slower economic growth, often lead to recession. And that's intentional. When the Fed tightens monetary policy, when any central bank tightens monetary policy, the goal is to weaken the economy to reduce inflationary pressure. The Fed failed to do that, although inflation did come down although in my view it didn't come down because of what the Fed did. It came down largely because of the end of the pandemic. But if you look at this chart, the blue line shows quarter-to-quarter growth of real GDP in the U.S. at an annualized rate. And just for comparison, the red line is quarter-to-quarter growth of real GDP in the Eurozone. And so you can see that the U.S. performed much better than Europe, even though both places had similar circumstances: a rise of inflation to a 40-year high, a significant tightening of monetary policy, a drop in inflation, and now central banks starting to cut interest rates. And yet the similarities end there. The U.S. had extraordinary growth. In 7 of the last 8 quarters, real GDP increased at an annualized rate of over 2%. And that's in an economy that probably in the long run can only grow in the neighborhood of 1.5% to 2%. So why is this? Why has the U.S. economy been so resilient? Well, one reason is actually immigration. And you've probably heard that that's a fraught political issue in the United States right now. But the reality is that immigration helped to bring inflation down because it boosted the size of the labor force, it eased the tightness of the labor market, and helped to reduce wage pressure and therefore inflationary pressure. And that also gave the Federal Reserve room to stop tightening monetary policy and to now start to loosen monetary policy. In the absence of immigration, that would not have been the case. There are other reasons. One is that consumer balance sheets in the U.S. are unusually strong. Usually when central banks tighten monetary policy, it's at the end of the business cycle when consumer and business balance sheets are highly leveraged, and so they're very vulnerable to higher interest rates. That wasn't the case this time because with the pandemic, both households and businesses got a lot of government support, paid off a lot of debts, hoarded a lot of cash, and so when high interest rates came, didn't make as much of a difference to them as normally. In the U.S., unlike here in Canada, most people get a 30-year mortgage on their home, and recently most people had fixed-rate mortgages, which meant even as mortgage interest rates increased sharply, most households didn't feel the effect of that on their cash flow. That's very different than in Canada. Plus, we've had growing employment and real wages. All of those things have contributed to strong consumer spending growth. And business investment has held up well, too. Businesses hoarded cash during the pandemic, so they had plenty of cash to invest in the last 2 years. Many businesses have shifted from short-term to long-term financing, which have made them less vulnerable to higher interest rates. And then 2 pieces of legislation in the U.S., the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, provided incentives for domestic investment in high technology and clean energy. And we've seen the effects of that with a surge in investment by the manufacturing sector. So these are some of the reasons why the U.S. has done quite well. Let's look at a few other countries, beginning with Mexico here in North America. Mexico has seen economic growth slow down. This chart shows year-over-year percent change of real GDP. It has been decelerating sharply. So there's now, giving a lot of speeches lately, so I'm losing my voice. Now we're seeing very slow economic growth in Mexico with continued high interest rates with the goal of reducing inflation, which has come down but remains too high. On the positive side, Mexico has been a beneficiary of some of the supply chain diversification we've seen globally, especially the attempt by many global companies to reduce their exposure to China. Mexico has been an attractive place to invest, especially to gain access to the North American market. On the other hand, the new government of Claudia Sheinbaum has implemented judicial reforms that some people see as hurting the independence of the judiciary and thereby hurting property rights and potentially stifling investment. And indeed, just this past week, President Sheinbaum held an investment summit in Mexico City where she invited the CEOs of major North American companies to try to convince them that despite these reforms, Mexico is still open for business. But finally, in the longer term, the biggest risk to Mexico is the U.S., and especially the potential for changes in U.S. trade policy depending on the outcome of our election. And as you know, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, is set to be renegotiated in 2026, and that's a major concern for Mexico and, of course, for Canada. Turning to the second largest economy in the world, which has a big impact on everyone else, China. China has seen a perfect storm of negative factors that have driven much slower economic growth than in the past. The chart you see here is percent change of real GDP year over year over a long period of time. For a long time, China was growing in the neighborhood of 10 or 12%, no longer. Now China says their goal is 5% growth. It's not clear they're going to make that. There are a number of factors. One is the collapse of the residential property sector, which is likely to continue over several years. Another factor is worsening demographics. The working age population is declining. The overall population is declining. For a while, that was offset by a large amount of internal migration, people moving from farms to factories, which immediately boosted their productivity, but that migration has largely ended and may even be reversing. The government has discriminated against and even harassed the private sector, including foreign companies, and so private sector investment has stalled, is no longer growing. And consumer demand is weak because most households in China derive 70% of their wealth from property, and with property values having come down, they've lost wealth and they've chosen to save more rather than spend. Now, monetary policy has eased to fight this. It hasn't succeeded, and now there's a lot of talk about fiscal stimulus to deal with China's problems, but it may be too small. Meanwhile, the government is very focused on the production of exportable high-value products like electric vehicles, solar panels, semiconductors, and yet they're producing too much. They can't export everything they produce. They have excess capacity, and that's fueling deflation. So the outlook for China is actually fairly poor, and that has consequences for the global economy. For countries that export a lot to China, that means less growth of exports. On the other hand, China's weakness will mean less demand for commodities, which will reduce growth of commodity prices, which is good for many countries, but not necessarily good for Canada. And then Europe. This is economic growth in the Eurozone, also very feeble. The Eurozone last year skirted recession, avoided it, but Germany did go into recession, and neighboring UK, which is not part of the Eurozone, also went into recession. Now, consumer spending was restrained by high interest rates, high energy costs, uncertainty, and real wages have been rising, but consumers have been sitting on their hands. That might change in the coming year if consumers feel more confident, especially now that the European Central Bank is starting to cut interest rates. The labor market does remain tight, which fuels the remaining inflation, but also fuels wage growth, which could help consumer spending. The biggest obstacles to European recovery are the continuing effects of the Russian energy shock, weak demand in China, which is a major market for European exporters, and an increasingly competitive global environment where many European countries feel they're not capable of competing with countries from China and the United States. And finally, Canada. And this is economic growth in Canada, which has also slowed down and is very slow right now. And as you know, part of the problem has been poor productivity growth, which is one of the reasons you're all here today to address that issue. On the positive side, you've had very strong immigration here, which I think plays a positive role in economic growth and certainly a positive role in productivity, because we know historically, not just in Canada but in many other countries, immigrants are risk takers. And so they're more likely to be entrepreneurial, to start businesses, to innovate. And in fact, if you look at Silicon Valley, in my home state of California, a very disproportionate share of the founders of some of the major technology companies were immigrants or the children of immigrants. So this is a very positive thing, in my view. On the other hand, it's led to housing shortage, higher housing costs, and that can be an obstacle to consumer spending growth here in Canada. And consumer spending has slowed as labor market conditions have worsened in response to the persistent tight monetary policy of the Bank of Canada. But the good news is the Bank of Canada is easing monetary policy, and so that should help to alleviate some of the stress in the economy in the year to come. And just as is the case in Mexico, perhaps one of the biggest risks to Canada is my country, not just the health of our economy, but also our trade policy. As you may have read, one of our candidates for president, Donald Trump, has said he wants to impose a 10, maybe 20% tariff on all imports from all countries. That would have a devastating impact on our economy, but it would also have a devastating impact on yours. It's not clear he has the legal authority to do that, and it's not clear that that would pass muster with the existing USMCA. But meanwhile, he wants to impose severe tariffs on China, and he wants a full renegotiation of the USMCA when it comes up for renewal in 2026. Interestingly, he's been critical of the USMCA, even though he negotiated it. So let me say a few words about globalization, because we've seen a number of unexpected shocks to the global economy in recent years that have raised questions about the future of globalization. And again, in my view, globalization, which is the reduction of barriers to the movement of goods and capital and people, is a good thing. It boosts productivity, it boosts innovation, it boosts competitiveness, and it boosts economic growth. But globalization was predicated on stability, on the ability of global companies to make reasonably good predictions about supply and demand patterns and design their supply chains accordingly to achieve low cost and high speed. But in recent years, we've seen unexpected shocks which revealed the fragility of global supply chains. Again, we had trade wars, pandemic, war in Ukraine, lockdowns in China. Those things created disruption, delays, shortages, higher costs, and raised questions about the future of globalization. It led many people to say, this era of globalization is now over. Now we're going to pivot to deglobalization, reshoring of supply chains. I don't think so. I don't think the evidence shows that that's happening. Instead, trade and cross-border investment continue to be important. But what has changed is global companies, while they still care about low cost and high speed, increasingly care about the resilience and redundancy of their supply chains, having been shaken by the fragility of their supply chains. And that implies diversification. And nowhere is that more true than with respect to China. So the chart you see here shows two different measures of inbound investment into China produced by two agencies of the Chinese government. They're actually different, but the trend is the same, a sharp decline in inbound foreign direct investment into China as global companies decide to reduce their exposure to China to reduce risk. They're almost sort of buying an insurance policy against future disruption. And so that diversification has involved a particular focus on investing instead in Southeast Asia, in India, and again in Mexico. Indeed, we're actually seeing many Chinese companies invest in Mexico. Oh, thank you very much. Okay. We're actually seeing many Chinese companies invest in Mexico, and that's one of the issues that will likely come up when the USMCA is renegotiated, because Donald Trump says he doesn't want to allow products made by Chinese companies assembled in Mexico to enter the U.S. tariff-free. So that is, and I'm not sure what Kamala Harris's attitude on that will be, but clearly when it comes to China, the U.S. is relatively united in its intent to limit economic interaction with China. And indeed, the one caveat I'd say to my argument about globalization is that in some industries we're now seeing a decoupling between China and the West, and especially between China and the U.S., because the U.S., the European Union, and Japan have limited exports of key technologies and transfers of key technologies to China, and they have subsidized reshoring of processes involving high technology and clean energy. So to some extent, there is a bit of a decoupling taking place, but the U.S. will have to be careful not to have a full decoupling, because that would probably be bad, not only for the U.S., but for the global economy. So let me talk about some of the headwinds facing the global economy, because so far, the outlook I've offered is relatively benign. Continued growth of the global economy, lower inflation, lower interest rates, it's all good. So you might ask the question, what could possibly go wrong? So let's talk about that. Well, there is this fraught Chinese-Western relationship, which is very poor right now, but it's somewhat stable. But it could worsen, depending on actions both by the West and by China itself. For example, if China continues to threaten Taiwan, or does so more, or invades Taiwan, or if the U.S. imposes very significant new tariffs on China, that kind of worsening of the relationship would likely lead to an acceleration of the diversification of supply chains. In the short term, it would probably have the impact of increasing costs and possibly reducing productivity. In the long term, it might actually be a good thing. Already, the diversification we have seen has led to a change in trade patterns. So, for example, the U.S. now trades less with China than it used to. It trades more with Southeast Asia and Mexico. For the U.S., its biggest trading partner right now is Mexico. It used to be China. But that doesn't mean that China doesn't play a role in the world. Many of the products being exported to the U.S. from Southeast Asia have embedded in them inputs or intermediate goods that were made in China. So China's role in the world hasn't really diminished, but the role has changed. There's been a kind of pivot. Then there's the Russia-Ukraine war, which is a long slog, which just continues. But there is the possibility that the U.S. and its allies might decide to limit support for Ukraine and force a settlement that would be seen as a victory for Russia. If that were to happen, I think it would embolden Russia to threaten other countries in Europe. It would certainly weaken NATO and weaken the ties between the U.S. and Europe, and probably affect cross-Atlantic trade and cross-border investment, and probably lead to a further acceleration of defense spending in Europe. We know, for example, that Poland has been acquiring the minerals needed to produce nuclear weapons. So they want to be prepared should Russia be seen as a victor in the war with Ukraine. And such a victory would also likely embolden China to further threaten Taiwan. Then there's the clean energy transition, which is absolutely necessary to save the planet, but it is disruptive. And it could have a negative effect on productivity, and let me explain why. Back in the 1970s, and sadly, I'm old enough to remember this, back in the 70s, when we had multiple energy shocks leading to a huge increase in oil prices, there was a big incentive for companies to invest in energy savings. And they did it successfully, so that today we use much less energy per dollar GDP than we did back in the 70s. But that investment in energy efficiency diverted funds from investment that might have boosted productivity. And the end result was that for the global economy as a whole, in the 1970s, productivity growth slowed down dramatically. And then it recovered in the 80s. And an argument can be made that that was because of that energy shock. Today, we're investing heavily in a new energy transition. That's very necessary, but it might also divert funds from other types of investment that would boost productivity. And as a consequence, we could see at least a temporary slowdown in productivity growth. And finally, we see a lot of geopolitical volatility right now. A war in Ukraine, a war in the Middle East, a threat of war in Asia. These types of things create uncertainty, and uncertainty is not what business needs, and it might have a stifling effect on investment and therefore productivity growth. So I'd like to end on a positive note. What are some of the opportunities for the global economy? Well, one thing is we're seeing an awful lot of investment in IT right now. It's already boosted productivity in the US, and a lot of the investment that's taking place today that will ultimately boost productivity is in generative AI, and I was pleased to hear that Alberta is a major center for AI. And so we do know that when new technologies are introduced, it takes time before we see that show up in the productivity numbers. So we're not necessarily going to see it right away. I remember back in the 1980s when companies invested furiously in desktop computers for their office workers, thinking that this would immediately boost productivity. But we didn't really see it show up in the productivity numbers until the late 1990s. So it took about a decade to figure out how to use this technology in a way that really improved our efficiency. I don't know if that will be true of Gen AI, but it might be. But what I do know is that when new technologies are introduced, they often lead to new industries and companies that nobody anticipated. So for example, in the 80s, when the mobile telephone was introduced, and I remember thinking, this is great, I'll be able to make a phone call in my car. It didn't occur to me that I'll be able to order an Uber. What was an Uber? It didn't occur to me that I'd be able to move money in my banking account, or change my seat on an airplane, or watch a movie, or read a newspaper, or listen to music. These were things that came about, industries and companies that came about because of a new technology that we hadn't anticipated. And I think the same will likely be true with generative AI. Also, in many countries in the world, in the US, in Western Europe, in China, Japan, Russia, and elsewhere, there are very poor demographics, declining working age populations, putting stress on pensions and health care, slowing economic growth. But there are parts of the world with favorable demographics, especially Africa and India. And I think those are places where we'll see a lot of consumer spending growth, a lot of opportunity to invest and take advantage of relatively inexpensive labor, and much faster economic growth. Indeed, today, the fastest growing large economy in the world is India. And finally, a lot of people point to China and other authoritarian countries as having an advantage because without the messiness of democracy, they can easily get stuff done. And that may be true. But without the messiness of democracy, they don't have the free flow of information that we do in democratic, market-driven economies. And I think in this information age, that's going to be critical. And a competitive advantage will accrue to more open economies, not just in terms of being open to trade and investment, but open to ideas, open to the free flow of information. So those are my thoughts about the global economy, and I'm happy to take questions with Trevor.
Great, thank you very much, Ira. So there's no shortage of important issues to unpack, and so I'm confident that there are many questions from the many folks in the audience here. So do feel free to go up to the microphones, which are in the aisle as they were yesterday. While you're gathering your thoughts, maybe I'll start with one that builds on a final point you made about how there's a competitive advantage for open economies, taking advantage of some of the opportunities that are ahead. And I couldn't agree more that more openness does enhance productivity, but it also exposes an economy to risk. You know, especially in small open economies like Canada, where such a large fraction of economic activity is tied to trade. We have the short-term disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and supply chain disruptions, as you noted. This longer-term challenge of potentially globalization, or as the Peterson Institute, I think, put it, slowbalization. And I'm encouraged to hear you're kind of skeptical about that as a longer-term trend. But how should economies like Canada's prepare or become more resilient in the face of these short-term shocks, and to think about the potential for falling international trade as a share of overall economic activity?
Well, that's a very good question. It is true that less open economies, more authoritarian economies can sometimes have greater stability. I mean, if you look back at the old Soviet Union, it was pretty stable. Everybody had a job. They didn't have much money, but they didn't go through business cycles. We do go through business cycles. We do have ups and downs. One way in a market-oriented economy you deal with the vicissitudes of business cycles is you have an adequate social safety net, which I think Canada certainly has. We probably have less in the U.S. And that helps to sort of smooth out the rough edges. Another thing is you need to be able to set aside money for a rainy day. So commodity-oriented economies like Norway, for example, have managed to accumulate a sovereign wealth fund, which enables them to provide a return on investment to their households, even when the economy tanks, even when oil prices decline. I think having fiscal rectitude helps you be in a position to do that. It also helps you be in a position to spend money when it's necessary when there is an economic downturn. So there's no way to completely avoid risk, but there are ways to buy an insurance policy against risk.
Thank you, and I do see we do have a question here on the left.
Thank you. Great presentation. I enjoyed that. Larry Shembry from the Fraser Institute. Just on that, on Trevor's comment, I mean, we also have a flexible exchange rate, which helps stabilize our economy in the face of global shocks. My question for you is you didn't mention fiscal situations in many advanced economies as a potential downside risk. I mean, after the global recession, in which deficits increased and debt increased, we had a fiscal consolidation that was agreed to by the G20. That hasn't happened after the pandemic, and what are your views on that situation, especially with the U.S. Debt to GDP ratio approaching 100%, not seen since the end of World War II?
That's right. So you're right. I mean, fiscal consolidation is important in the long term, but there's a balancing act. So, for example, after the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, Eurozone economies had very tight fiscal policies, which wound up hurting their economic growth and leading to a debt crisis that had to be resolved when Mario Draghi, who then led the European Central Bank, said that we will do whatever it takes to save the euro, and he had a very expansive monetary policy in the face of a tight fiscal policy. On the other hand, you're right, in the U.S., we now have a budget deficit in the neighborhood of 6 or 7% of GDP at a time of full employment. That shouldn't be the case. We should have a smaller budget deficit, and moving in that direction will require somewhat slower economic growth. It will also require a degree of political statesmanship that's not been in evidence in either political party. Now, for most developed countries, the fiscal challenge is mainly a demographic challenge. It's the fact that the population is getting older, the working age population is declining relative to the aging population. That is putting stress on pensions and health care. And there are certain solutions to that problem. You could have higher taxes. You could have less benefits for retirees. You could raise the retirement age gradually, which in the U.S. we did back in the 1980s. And you could allow a lot more immigration, which boosts the ratio of workers to retirees. My view is that major developed economies would be wise to do a little bit of all of those things. That would help to deal with the fiscal imbalance without having to destroy the economy. But I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen. So what's the risk? The risk is that if countries continue to run up debt, especially the U.S., at some point in the distant future, investors might recoil from funding that debt, in which case we'll see a sharp rise in bond yields, and that will hurt business investment and economic growth. Or the other thing that could happen is the central bank winds up monetizing that debt, and we wind up with ruinous inflation. We're nowhere near that yet, and we have time to fix the problem, but if we don't fix the problem, eventually it will come back to bite us.
Thank you.
Maybe if I could actually build on that thought there. I mean, the longer-term fiscal trajectory that many countries are on can certainly be addressed with things like changing the retirement age, changes in taxes and spending trajectories, but our ability to absorb short-term shocks is also a function of how much debt we have going into those shocks. And countries like Canada did increase our overall amount of public debt considerably through the pandemic, and some jurisdictions like Alberta's has come down since, but not all jurisdiction. Are you worried that certain countries, Canada and others, may not have the fiscal capacity to absorb a large-scale shock to come?
I think that is a concern. It's less of a concern for the U.S. because the U.S. has what's been called the exorbitant privilege of issuing debt in its own currency, of having its currency be the dominant world currency. And so everybody wants to hold U.S. securities, and that suppresses U.S. bond yields and makes it easy for the U.S. to run large deficits without major consequences. The same is not true of other countries like Canada, the UK, members of the Eurozone, and especially emerging countries. So yes, I agree that it's probably more important for those other countries to gradually move toward fiscal probity. I don't think it's a good idea to do it too quickly because that will hurt economic growth significantly. But it makes sense to set a target, maybe 10 or 15 years, to get to a position where the fiscal stance is relatively stable, not onerous, and leaves flexibility to deal with external shocks.
Great, thank you. I think there's just one microphone, so yeah, please.
Thank you. You mentioned that immigration is enhancing to productivity. Does that not depend on the nature of the immigration and whether the people who immigrate are skilled or educated? Doesn't it depend on this, what they bring when they come to Canada?
Yes and no. I mean, when you bring in highly skilled immigrants, they have an immediate positive impact. That's true. When you bring in low-skilled immigrants, they boost the labor force, they suppress inflation, they don't contribute yet to entrepreneurship or innovation. But very often their children do, because certainly what I've seen in the US is that the low-skill, low-wage immigrants who come in have great aspirations for their children, and they push their children to do well in school, and often they do. And so that next generation winds up having a big positive contribution. And the fact that the US and Canada, which are both countries largely made up of the descendants of immigrants, the fact that these are two of the richest countries in the world is no accident. I think it has a lot to do with the risk-taking nature of that long line of immigrants. So even if you get low-skill immigrants now who don't speak the language and where there's a lot of effort involved in integrating them into the society, I think in the long run it winds up paying off.
But what about the possibility that the high level of immigration is actually causing some inflation, such as unaffordable housing?
Well, yeah, you do have a problem in Canada, evidently, with housing, which is there's a disequilibrium in the housing market fueled by immigration. And you're right, that does contribute to inflation. So that is a problem that needs to be addressed. I don't think the way to address the problem is to stifle the immigration, because that's sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think the thing to do is to stimulate more home building. And maybe the government can play a role in doing that. But I think the immigration is, on balance, in the long run, a positive thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. In the center here.
Hi, my name's Tina Petra. I'm a municipal politician in Alberta here and a director for our municipal association in the province. So not an economist. This has all been very fascinating. I deal in people and processes most of the time. I just wanted to touch on maybe a smaller part of your presentation today. And Minister Jones talked about, the skill building and how many people were getting into those programs. And you talked about labor force participation. But throughout these last 2 days, I've heard a lot about labor force participation, but mainly in the context of educating people, making sure we have people ready to work, making sure they're educated properly, making sure they have the skills. But the one thing that I haven't heard talked about is the mental health of the labor force. And I think it's a very small part of this conversation when we're talking about investment, but when we're talking about communities that people or that businesses want to go to, if you don't have a labor force that's mentally capable to be in those jobs, sometimes it's a little hard to attract that investment. So in all the conversations that are being had on productivity and that, does mental health come up in those conversations? We really need to make sure that we have the people who are mentally capable and not on short and long-term disability and not taking those paid sick leaves, because that's a massive productivity barrier for corporations. Thanks.
That's a very good question, and I haven't heard that issue come up, to be honest. What I have heard come up is just overall health, physical health, but mental health is a part of that, and that's very important. And in my country, we've had a fairly large number of people leave the labor force to go on disability insurance because of very often mental health issues, but also physical health issues. So if those issues could be resolved in a way that enables those people to participate in the labor force, that would have a positive impact on the economy. And I think, as you probably know, mental health has been one of the issues that people don't want to talk about very often. But it's real. I mean, mental illness is real, mental problems are real, and the ability to address those issues would be good for the people who suffer from them, but would also be good for the larger economy. So I agree with you, that's an important issue. And it's been a problem in the US that so many people have moved out of the labor force into disability insurance because of physical and mental problems that aren't being properly addressed.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And just, I think from my position in municipalities, talking to businesses is something we hear about from every sector. It's not specific to anything. We see it in our own municipalities, and it's becoming a growing problem. So I appreciate you addressing the question, and hopefully that's a conversation. Like, I talk about it all the time, so I hope everyone else can talk about it too. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you for that very important question. And to the left?
In the conversations that have been had at this meeting, there's been a focus on tax policy and regulation and competitiveness and interprovincial trade barriers and so on. Briefly, on a couple of occasions, the issues in the development of highly qualified management teams in an economy have come up. For example, the higher educational levels of the managerial workforce in the U.S. compared to Canada. I wanted to see if you had any comments as to the role of the sociology and the structure of the managerial environment and the development and its influence on the development of skills in the managerial workforce.
That's an interesting question. I have to say it's not really my area of expertise, but I'll try to comment. I've been in the professional business labor force for almost 40 years, and I've seen a lot of change. And I've seen, I think, on balance, an improvement in the quality of management in U.S. companies that I've worked in or dealt with. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if it has to do with higher levels of education. I suspect it also has to do with a greater degree of worldliness, that many companies now are sending their workers to live in other countries or move them around to different functions and allow them to be exposed to a greater diversity of situations, and I think that improves their skill. I think the other thing I've seen is that when I started out in the business world in the late 1980s, every managerial person I dealt with was a middle-aged white man. Literally, every one. And that's no longer the case. And I think that increase in diversity and the openness to bringing people into managerial positions who previously didn't have that opportunity has also helped to boost the quality of management. Now, if you say management is better in the U.S. than Canada, I don't know. I can't judge that. So I don't know what the circumstances are that might have to do with that. But those are my observations on how management has evolved.
And turning to perhaps the final question.
Good morning. My name is Jim Dinning, and I just wanted to address Trevor a comment that was made yesterday that got repeated ad nauseum, and that was from Professor Reagan, who talked, and then repeated by many others, that we're not going to have to work harder, we just have to work smarter or better. And I worry that it is a soothing bromide, that too many leaders aren't willing to talk candidly about how hard improving productivity is really going to be. And I think we need the candor from elected folks, from senior public servants, from business leaders, from not-for-profit leaders, from academic leaders like you, Trevor, to say, we got into this ditch. It's going to be hard work, and we're going to have to work harder and better and smarter to get out of it. So I know I'm supposed to ask a question, so I'll ask this question, sir. Has there ever been an immigrant family moved to the Silicon Valley whose parents or grandparents said to their kids, you don't have to work harder, kids, you just got to work smarter?
No, the answer is no.
All right, well, I do have a little bit of time, so I want to dig in actually to one issue that you raised as an opportunity going forward, and a topic that we talked a lot about yesterday actually in one of our sessions, and that's artificial intelligence. This is certainly potential for a source of productivity growth in the future, but the pace and speed of that and the disruption that it might represent for certain types of occupations and sectors is perhaps faster and harder to adjust to than technological changes of the past. And I think this is quite relevant to think about looking at the United States or different regions even of Canada. Technology and trade has disrupted manufacturing, left non-trivial segments of the population in a potentially worse off situation, even though the overall and the average has been improved from it. So how do you think about the pace of change that AI might represent, and how should policymakers and businesses think about adapting to it?
That's a very important question, because when we did see information technology disrupt manufacturing, leading to the loss of many manufacturing jobs, especially assembly line work, and where manufacturers wound up with a shortage of software engineers, this kind of set the stage for a populist backlash, actually. And so we've seen in North America and Europe the rise of populism, where working class people who were disrupted by technology are resentful, feel they've been left behind. And even though, in my view, what disrupted them was technology, they have become amenable to the argument that what disrupted them are foreigners, immigrants, foreign goods, trade, so they become very xenophobic, very protectionist, very isolationist. And in my view, that's not a good thing. The danger is AI could exacerbate that, because it might lead not just to changes in manufacturing, but to every industry. And it won't just disrupt the lower level workers, it will disrupt mid-level workers. In fact, there have been some studies looking at what classes of workers are likely to be seriously disrupted. And a lot of middle management might disappear because of the potential use of generative AI. Now, does that mean we'll suddenly have mass unemployment? I don't think so, because that's never been the case before with new technologies. Usually when you have new technologies, because they boost productivity growth and boost the size of the economic pie and increase aggregate demand in the economy, that leads to increased demand for labor. So then we wind up with faster labor supply growth as a consequence of that, which shouldn't be hard to deal with at a time when we're facing labor shortages. The other thing is new technologies, as I indicated, lead to the creation of new industries and new companies, and that too creates jobs. So I'm reasonably confident that AI, while it will disrupt a lot of jobs, will probably also lead to the creation of a lot of jobs. But the challenge as a society is to make sure that the skill set of the labor force shifts commensurately. Because if it doesn't, then we have a problem. And you can argue that when the computer revolution came and disrupted some jobs, we didn't have a commensurate shift in the composition of the labor force, and that exacerbated income inequality and did lead some people to be left behind. So I think that's the big challenge, is skills, education, and that's going to be difficult, actually.
Well, on that largely optimistic note, I think that's a good point to end. So Ira, thank you very much. You gave us a thoughtful tour of the world and trends for us to think about and to talk about. And on that note, it's...